What is going on, gunfighters, aspiring gunfighters, boys and girls, shooters of all ages? Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, equipment, the right way, with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Today we're going to be talking about Glocks and the differences between Glock generations. Maybe the similarities too, and some subjective things about what I like and don't like about different gens. Anyhow, that's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life, if that interests you. I'm going to throw in a quick rapid-fire bio and we'll get into the topic. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review of the podcast, and share with somebody you think will enjoy it. Blessed to have served in the military, law enforcement, combat veteran, private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that He got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and fingers for battle. Psalm 144. So lately I've been shooting a lot of Glock, and not just because I felt like slumming it, but because a new job requires it. Doing some gun for hire work, some government contracting work, and that means I'm carrying a Glock again. And why do Glocks get those contracts? Not because they're the best gun. People might think that, because they're the best. How about because economy of scale, and they cut deals, and contracts are generally done on the cheapest bidder. And I'll criticize Glocks for a lot, but not for marketing strategy. If they cut a good deal to military and law enforcement and stuff like that, they know that people will buy their guns at a higher price for the over-the-counter price. Anyway, whatever though, that's probably its own episode for its own time. But like it or not, Glock is the standard. It makes up a giant market share. Glocks have been around a long time. But know that I am not the biggest fanboy of Glock. I'm not the dyed-in-the-wool, drink the Kool-Aid, got a Glock tramp stamp tattooed on my back. I'm not that dude. So if you're looking for that dude, that ain't me. I'll try and be fair. I don't think Glocks are the best pistol out there. They're not the worst. They work. They last a long time. But just know that when I talk about a Glock trigger being better than another Glock trigger, that doesn't mean I think it's a good trigger. Just some of those caveats out of the way. And some of this, to be fair, I'll try and give credit where credit is due, because I don't know all the stuff. I knew that Glock was introduced in the early 80s, but I had to look up from Wikipedia the Glock 17 introduced in 1981. That's before I was born. By a few years. But the Glock 17 introduced in 1981. We consider the Glock 17 the OG, the original Glock. It's a good Glock. I'm talking about the old, what I would consider the Gen 1. The old original Glock. Now, another caveat, you could really nerd out on this stuff and say, there's a lot of stuff about Glock that I don't know. I know quite a bit, and I know it mostly from professional using of the Glock and not from like an engineering standpoint. But there's probably people out there listening that are collectors of Glocks and know a lot more. They're like, well, yeah, all the Gen 1s aren't the same because this generation of Gen 1 versus Gen 2 has, 2 metal pins and 1 polymer pin here. Slightly change in manufacturing technique from Tenefer to whatever they use now in this year in this generation. I get that there are differences, and I get that you can get real down in the weeds. I'm talking about general differences between the Glock generations, to throw that out there. They've been making Glock Gen 3s a long time, for instance. There's going to be some variance between the original, not even the original Glock, but the first run of Glock Gen 3s, even Gen 3 17s, and the new, because they still make Gen 3 17s. There's going to be a lot of variance. So I'm not going to try and get down into every single little difference. But focus more on differences from a user standpoint. Like differences the user, the shooter, the gunfighter would notice with a gun in his hand. Looking at targets, being able to discern the difference. Okay, the old school Gen 1s are probably my second favorite of all of them. The Gen 1s, the OG tactical Tupperware, literally came in a Tupperware type box. These are fairly easy to distinguish because they have very little in the way of grip texture, and they also don't have finger grooves. They're very sleek, very svelte, very minimalist, even by Glock standards. And to give credit where it's due, I got some of this from Glock.pro, which I was not aware of, so I looked up the difference between the Gen 1 and Gen 2. Now, the Gen 1 and Gen 2 both lack finger grooves, which I think is fantastic. But the Gen 1 has a pretty uniform grip texture around it. The Gen 2 is slightly different in that it has more aggressive grip texture in the front and the back, but a very similar grip texture on the side to the Gen 1. But no finger grooves on the Gen 1 or the Gen 2. The Gen 1, really sleek, really svelte, and no aggressive texturing in the front or the back of the grip module. Also, you'll notice some commonalities between the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 from a user standpoint. They do not have a light rail on the bottom. A Glock's not a true 1913 rail or anything, but it doesn't have the common Glock rail that we are used to. That did not come about until the Gen 3. These are older and more obscure. If you get one that's already used and beat up, no issues, but there are actually people that collect Glocks. I know that's astounding, but it's a thing. My advice would be, if you get one that's well used and well worn, don't worry about it. But if you get one in really, really good condition, like in the Tupperware box, like really good pristine condition Gen 1 or early Gen 2s, I would say probably either keep it if you want to collect it, because it'll probably go up in value, or sell it to a collector and buy a newer one to actually shoot, because I don't know the exact numbers. I'm not going to get into the minutia of this, but look up how many Gen 1s were made and Gen 2s were made versus how many Gen 3s have been made. It's going to be a ton of Gen 3s and later gens. We think of Glock as being a giant market share in the American market. However, it didn't start out that way. People were kind of skeptical of this plastic fantastic when it first came out, and the initial impression and the initial numbers were not game-changing. It was kind of a snowball effect. Once it started to get going, and they got some steam behind them, they really pumped out a lot of guns. But the Gen 1s and the Gen 2s, not nearly as many of those floating around. Plus, some of these are from 81, 82, 83, 84. The early 80s, they've been around a while. If you find one in pristine condition, my advice would be maybe either keep it as a collector or sell it for a pretty penny and get a newer gen that they're still making. Now, there are some variants that aren't being made, but all the later gens, the Gen 3 is still being made. Now, when my first issue duty firearm outside of the military, when I got out of the Marine Corps, I joined LAPD. My first issue duty gun was a Glock, and it was a Glock Gen 3. It was an atrocious Glock Gen 3 22. And nothing wrong with there's a lot of things wrong with Glock, but it wasn't so much the Glock. And it's not so much the 40. It's the combination of the Glock and the 40. It's just like oil and water. They just shouldn't mix, in my opinion. Hate on me if you want. But the Gen 3 Glock was the first one to jump into the finger groove arena. And I can't stand finger grooves. I don't know whose fingers they line up for with what kind of grip, but it ain't mine. I just can't stand them. Even if they do line up, I don't know what they give you. And if they don't line up, they're really kind of a pain in the butt when your finger rides directly on top of the finger groove. I don't like it. I don't like them. I don't like anything about the finger grooves. If you got finger grooves on your gun and it's not a duty gun, one word for you, Dremel. Or a big bastard file. But finger grooves, just atrocious. I think they went backwards on that. I don't like finger grooves if you can't tell. Ugh. But some good things on the Gen 3. The Gen 3s have a pretty decent trigger by Glock standards. They have a pretty good trigger. They also are the first gen that I'm aware of that has the rail on the bottom, so you could mount a light. That's kind of a big deal. And you'll see, I don't know when they went to this, but I do believe that all of the Gen 3s have 3 pins. They did this to make it a little bit stronger. because of, again, the 40. Glock was originally designed for a 9. I think it should have stayed that way, but somebody in their infinite wisdom decided to shove a 40 in a Glock, and they wanted it a little bit stronger. Glocks have had issues too. Everybody thinks Glocks don't break or anything like that. They have had issues, and a lot of those issues came about with the early 40s, early 40 calibers in Glock. They had to make the frame stronger. They had some issues with guns exploding and things like that. The Gen 3s have 3 pins. The Gen 3s have the rail on the bottom. The Gen 3s have some pretty tame grip texture. It's technically grip texture, but it's kind of like saying a Mini is technically an automobile, but so is a Ferrari. There's a lot of difference in performance there. Technically, it has grip texture. It has more aggressive grip texture in the back, and it's got their finger grooves in the front. Anyway, finger grooves. Also, these are still being made, and the patent on the Gen 3, I do believe, is expired. So if you see a lot of the aftermarket stuff and a lot of the aftermarket Glock clones, and if you want to mix and match and do stuff like that, and you really want a gun to trick out, the Gen 3 is probably your baby. Because, again, the patent's expired, and they still make new ones. And there's a lot of used ones floating around. There have been a lot of Gen 3s made, and they're still being made. So if you're the kind of guy that likes to trick out your Glock, the Gen 3 is probably for you. There's, just all kinds of different triggers, all kinds of different trigger bar connectors, recoil springs, tungsten guide rods. Oh, it also has a simpler recoil system. The Gen 1, 2, and 3s, except for, and this is one of those small caveats, except for the subcompacts like the 26 and 27, they all have a pretty simple recoil system. So like the 22, the 17, the 19, those kind of guns, they have a very simple recoil system with a spring and a guide rod. Later generations will become more complex, leading to some issues if you want to trick it out. If you want to, like, let's say, throw in a tungsten guide rod. They even make adapters to go from like the later gen recoil systems to the earlier gen recoil systems. But the Gen 1, 2, and 3s, again, with a few caveats, are going to have a real simple recoil system. Basically a guide rod and a spring. So real simple there. Again, these are real simple to work on. They're probably the one with the most aftermarket support by far. These are also, except for one exception, the original Glock Slimline, which was not the 42, it was not the 43. The original Glock Slimline was the Glock 36. 45 ACP single stack. I actually had one of these as my carry gun for a while. This is actually the first gen, I do believe, that you saw in the larger frame as well. The Glock 20 in 10mm and the Glock 21 in 45. I also carried a 45 on duty. I had a couple of 45s. Not the Glock Model 45, but the Glock Model 21 and 21C in 45 ACP. I know the numbers can get confusing. Just to go off on a tangent, the Glock 45 is a 9mm. The Glock 20 is a 10mm. The Glock 22 is a 40 Smith & Wesson, unless you just got to kind of memorize them, because the numbers don't really make any sense. Anyway, the Glock Gen 3s, also you'll see a lot of the bigger calibers, like the 10mm and the 45 ACP. They also have a big frame. I don't know if you would consider the SF that came out prior to the later gens. It's probably still a Gen 3, but an SF variant. There's a lot of variants. Let's not get off on too many tangents. But the Gen 3, easy to modify, patent expired, simple recoil system, accessory rail on the bottom, pretty decent trigger by Glock standards, atrocious finger grooves on there, pretty weak sauce, grip texture, and that kind of defines your Gen 3s. Then comes the Gen 4, and I was around during this era. I actually switched. I was big into competition shooting at the time. This is when the Gen 4 did not exist, and the Smith & Wesson M&P came on the scene hot and heavy, and it was modular. Like, it was the first popular modular handgun that I could remember where you could, like, change the back straps. That's pretty common today, but it wasn't at the time. And Smith & Wesson, M&P is a fine gun, and I switched to an M&P from a Glock, and mostly because it fit my hand better, and I could reach the controls without manipulating the gun in my hand. Which if you're going fast and taking chances, just drag racing with a pistol, those little fractions of a second add up. The difference between first and second and third can be a fraction of a second sometimes. So I went to the M&P because it was modular. And Glock, seeing this, as they often do, thinks, how can we change it? Well, I don't know what they actually think, but I get the impression that what they do is say, how can we change our design as little as possible and call it modular? So they made these back straps. So the Gen 4 is the first gen where you're going to see this quote-unquote modular Glock frame where it has back straps. And almost nobody runs it with a back strap. They just take the back straps off because they want a thinner grip, which makes a lot of sense. There are some exceptions, but you get the idea there. But it has the back straps, and it has the lines. I shouldn't say two. It has lines on the back to attach the back strap. It's kind of a dead giveaway. It also has a much more aggressive grip texture. Now, there was, in one of my favorite variants of the Glock that I ran for a while, one of the ones, actually, Glock I wish I had, which is hard to say for me, but the RTF, I think 1 or 2, I forget which one became mass adopted, but they had one that kind of felt like shark skin. That was a cool variant, and also had gill-like serrations. Almost all Glock serrations on the slide go up and down. However, these were like half moon serrations in the slide, and they had a really cool grip texture. I mean, it like grabbed your hand like it was trying to shake it. It was a fantastic model for a Glock. Anyway, that was the discontinued variant, but with the Gen 4, you see a much more aggressive, the one they went with, the rough texture frame RTF, if you see that. That was much more aggressive, and that was a better grip texture for actual using the gun. However, they still kept the finger grooves. I guess they had not learned their lesson yet. But they kept the finger grooves. They went with the back straps. They went with a more aggressive texture. They also, I don't know if they adopted it and made it longer from the subcompact variants, but if you look at the recoil system in the Gen 4s, whether it's a 17 or a 19 or whatever, the Gen 4s, they have a much more complicated recoil spring assembly than the earlier gens. So you'll see that. Now, it's more complicated. It also is supposed to last longer. So do you want a simple spring that's easy to change, or a more expensive complex spring that lasts longer? 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really. This is where you'll see that adaptation. You'll see the front of the gun. The recoil spring assembly hole is a little bit larger on the Gen 4s than the Gen 3s. People will say that recoil system is better. I would say that's subjective. It's certainly different. So that's one of the main differences. One of the main big advantages to the shooter, the end user, is going to be that aggressive grip texture. And if you have really, really big hands, then you might actually want to put the back straps on the gun. So that gives you some advantage. Also, in my opinion, the Gen 4s have a worse trigger, sadly. But I think they share a lot of the components and the trigger components with the earlier gens. So like the minus connector and things like that will probably still work with the Gen 4. Double check that. Now, the Gen 4 is still being made just like the Gen 3. Then they came out, and I don't think they called the 19X the Gen 5. But the 19X, the one that was made for and failed to get the military contract, the peanut butter Glock, as it's commonly jokingly referred to as, the peanut butter Glock, the 19X. That's what I would consider the first. Maybe they don't consider it a Gen 5. I don't know. But it's the first one that shares a lot of the attributes that I would attribute to a Gen 5, the newer Gen Glocks. And there's a lot that I like about the Gen 5 for Glock. They got rid of the finger grooves. Thankfully, they got rid of the finger grooves. That is fantastic. They also, one of the big things about Glock, if you don't know, they have a polygonal, however you pronounce it, barrel. The older Gen Glocks, the Gen 4s and before, Gen 1, 2, 3, and 4, they have polygonal rifling. If you look at it, it doesn't have sharp lands and grooves. Some people say it's better. Some people say it's worse. I will just say that it's different. It's not recommended that you shoot lead bullets through it. In my opinion, I don't think it's as accurate in the Glock barrels, but it has some advantages in that it's easier to clean. They last a long time. There's no sharp edges. There are advantages and disadvantages. And if you want traditional rifling in an older gen, just buy a new barrel. But that is a big difference. Going to the Gen 5, they put real rifling in it, like actual cut groove rifling. I think Glock calls it like the marksman barrel. In my experience, the Gen 5s are more accurate compared to other Glocks, which again, that doesn't mean it's accurate compared to a 1911 or compared to a H&K USP Expert or Mark 23. I'm saying it's accurate compared to other Glocks. I think the Gen 5s are more accurate. And they got rid of the finger grooves. They kept the texturing, which I like. They kept the modular backstrap system. They also went, I think actually the Gen 5, to me, seems to have more in common with the Gen 1, ironically, than the Gen 3 or 4. They got rid of the extra pin, and maybe not in all the models, but the ones I can think of, they got rid of the extra pin, so they went back to in my opinion, simpler design. Oh, one of the other things that may make a difference to you as far as the end user goes, most of the earlier gens use what kind of looks like a samurai sword firing pin. It looks like a little tanto-bladed kind of not cylindrical pin, whereas most other guns use what would look like a rounded pin, a firing pin, kind of like the end of a pen, P-E-N versus P-I-N. The Gen 5 Glock uses a more traditional, common to other guns, firing pin that looks like the end of a pen, P-E-N. It's just like a rounded protrusion that comes through the end of the slide. It's different than the earlier Gen Glocks. They don't interchange. Many of the things on the Gen 5 do not interchange with the earlier gens of Glock. Some things will, but not all things will. They thankfully kept it so I pretty much think it uses many of the same holsters. But it is probably the least advantageous if you want to trick it out because the patent's not expired, it's not that old, and a lot of the parts don't interchange with earlier Glocks. Oh, and I should back up and mention the Gen 4s. They also, from an end user standpoint, the Gen 4s went to a bigger magazine release, which is pretty cool. If your grip doesn't cause you to hit the magazine release, I actually prefer the earlier gens better. But if you do like the later gens, they have a bigger magazine release, and they also have the ability to make it ambidextrous, which the Gen 3s and earlier I don't believe do. Everybody's going to be right-handed magazine release. The Gen 4s and the Gen 5s have the ability for the user to swap it around so that it can be on the right side or the left side. I kind of glossed over that because I'm right-handed. It doesn't make a huge difference to me, but if you are left-handed, that is something to consider. But as a different magazine release button, keep in mind that all the older Glock generation magazines, if they're still serviceable, will work in the Gen 4s and the Gen 5s as long as it's set up for a right-handed shooter. If you set it up for a left-handed shooter, you need Gen 4 or Gen 5 magazines. Again, if you're right-handed, all the Glock magazines will work, provided they'll work in that frame size. But if you switch it over to left-handed, you need Gen 4 or Gen 5 magazines. Also, the Gen 5s, you'll see a lot of the newer slim-lined handguns, like the Glock 20, or the Glock 42, the Glock 43, 43X, 48, all that jazz, right? Except for the 36, the OG slimline 45 ACP, the modern single stack or like stack and a half or stack and a quarter, whatever they are, the slimline guns, those are going to be Gen 5s. I actually think the Gen 5 has one of the best triggers. I think it's better than the Gen 4. Again, of the Glocks, the Gen 5 as a user is my favorite. The Gen 1s, unless I got one of those really beat up, I would probably, again, sell it to a collector and buy a newer gun to use and beat up because they're not making more of the Gen 1s. So from a user standpoint, I personally really like the Gen 5s. They, in my experience, are more accurate. They have that more traditional barrel, more traditional firing pin. They have no finger grooves, which I like. They have a decent grip texture, which I like. So I like the Gen 5 of all the different generations. Again, the Gen 1s and the Gen 2s are pretty cool too, but don't see a lot of those around. Of the Gen 3, 4, and 5, I like the Gen 5. I probably like the Gen 4 the least. The old Gen 3s, again, you can get, there's a lot of those made, and they're still being made, so you can usually find good deals on those. And they're the easiest to work on. So if you want one just out of the box to be really good, I recommend the Gen 5. If you want one to really trick out and do a bunch of extra aftermarket stuff on, I recommend the Gen 3. And again, there's a lot of different minutia. There's been a lot of different finishes applied to the slides over the years. They've come in different colors. They've had a few different and discontinued variants. They've had different options for night sights. But from the end user standpoint, I think I hit the big, broad strokes for the differences between the generations of Glocks. I hope this was informative. I hope this was helpful. If it was, if you got any value out of this, consider becoming a patron. There's a lot of gun content out there that's just entertainment, which is fine. A lot of it, sadly, I think has become like the view for gun people, for like gun dudes, to sit around and talk about, well, I feel this about this gun, and I feel that about that gun, and let's talk about our feelings. And that's fine if that's what you want, but that's not what this is. And this is also not a bought and paid for, taking bribes. Oh, you should go out and trust your life to a Springfield XD. Because they're going to pay me a bunch of money to say that. I don't take sponsors. I've turned down sponsors because I want this to be an honest review, an honest show. If you appreciate that, if you appreciate the content, if you appreciate, hopefully, that you can listen to it without feeling dirty, without a bunch of blasphemy and disgusting words and all that stuff. If you appreciate any of that and you want to support the podcast, consider becoming a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. With that, your tactical tip of the day. I'll give you a few. I've been around the Glocks a long time, and apparently I can't escape from them because our new contract has some really old, antiquated technology Glock stuff. I assume because it was cheap. Anyhow, a couple of things I've learned over the years. If you want an extended magazine release and you're running the older gens, mostly the Gen 3s, if you're talking about a standard grip frame size like the 19, the 17, and you want it to be a little bit longer, you can actually put in a factory 20 or 21 magazine release. That'll make it stick out a little bit farther. So if you want a cheap, easy, extended magazine release on a Gen 3, let's say, 19 or 17, if you're running a 22, I feel sorry for you. I'm sorry. I can commiserate with that. But if you want an extended magazine release, get a magazine release from a factory Gen 3 Glock 20 or 21, and it will fit in there and stick out farther. Be careful that you can still use it in the holster. But that's an option. Also an option, one of the few ones, I believe, double check this, but that is approved for duty use, because a lot of the trigger mods are going to render that gun not approved for duty use, says Glock, which you may or may not care about. But if you want a good option that is approved, that's going to be the minus connector, which are awesome. They came factory in the Glock 34s, which is the long slide, which, not to get off on a tangent, but that's a really good variant if you want a bigger, better shooting Glock, again, compared to other Glocks. But anyway, came with a minus connector, and you can get a factory minus connector, which is a little bit lighter in trigger pull than the standard one. That, in and of itself, I don't think is approved to put in other Glocks. However, if you combine it with the New York 1, which makes a trigger pull even worse than a factory Glock. Can you believe that exists? Ugh. But anyway, the combo, if you put in a minus connector and an NY1 trigger spring, trigger return spring, then it gives you, I believe, pretty much the same weight in trigger, but a cleaner trigger. And a lot of times people, I think, look at triggers and think that a lighter trigger is a better trigger. That's not necessarily the case. I will take a heavy, crisp trigger over a light, mushy, wet noodle trigger any day. One of the things I like about the 1911 trigger, it's crisp, and I have a factory Colt, trigger, and it's not light, but it's beautifully crisp. I could probably put in a minus connector into a Glock and make it less weight than, especially with some different spring combinations, make it less weight than that 1911, but I would never call it better than the 1911. Anyway, if you want to get an approved duty combo with a similar weight to the factory trigger, but a cleaner trigger, like not so much mush. I've said before that pulling a Glock trigger to me is kind of like chewing on gravel or dragging a piano down a dirt road. Just gritty and grimy and crunchy, and then something breaks. And then you repeat the process. Not my favorite. But it'll give you a similar weight with a little bit cleaner trigger. So if you consider that, that's an option. Also, because of the way that the NY trigger system works, one of the things that does break on Glocks is the trigger spring. I don't know that the NY ones break. I'm sure they can break, but I think they break less than the standard factory trigger spring. So if you wanted to do that and make a Glock even more rugged and reliable, I think that would be a good option. You do that and you combine it with some maritime spring cups, which if you live in a wet, maritime environment, the maritime spring cups are another upgrade you might want to consider. Anyway, those are some tactical tips for the day on Glock. With that, your tactical verse of the day. I try and be fair. Glocks aren't the best from the end user standpoint, but they do last a long time, and they do work. So I may not like them, but they do take up a giant share of the market, and you can get the job done with them if you're up to the task. That's going to tie into today's verse of the day. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the innocent. That's from Deuteronomy 16. Thanks for listening, men, and have a blessed day.